Hi, my name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I'm excited to bring you today's webinar on the topic of how to build an effective collections model. Scoring has become ubiquitous among the ARM industry to help collection agencies analyze accounts in order to determine which individuals are most likely to pay their debts. But determining whether an individual is likely or not likely to pay their debt is only the first step in an effective collections operation. The next steps are the most important ones. A panel of experts has been assembled today, and they are here to share their insights and perspectives on what works best for their firms. This webinar is being generously sponsored by Microbilt, and I'll share some more information about them a little later in our program. I wanted to take one quick minute and say a few words about accountsrecovery.net. AR.net is the industry's largest network of professionals in the collections and debt buying industries. For nearly a decade, the site has sought to deliver the highest quality news and information via a networking platform that allows members to communicate and interact with one another in ways that they are not able to do anywhere else. The site is free for anyone in the industry to use and is a great resource of news and insights to help educate and inform. Let me tell you a little bit about today's speakers. LaDonna Bohling started out in the industry in 1984 working first-party collections, and then worked in the economic support department for the welfare department for 11 years in Georgia. In 1996, she joined Contract Callers Incorporated as manager of the utility collections portfolio. She then became the trainer for the agency, training all collection staff, and created their staff development program. Her work with the welfare department brought a unique flavor to the agency's collections process. Her mission in the agency was to change the mindset of the collection staff to treat consumers with dignity and respect, showing them that you can be successful as a collector using consumer-friendly methods. She currently serves as the director of call center operations with Contract Callers and is very active with the Georgia Collectors Association and has served on their board of directors since 2010. Mike Hiller is the vice president of collections for American Profit Recovery. He joined APR more than a decade ago as an entry-level employee and is a licensed collection manager in Michigan and serves as a subject matter expert for the state's Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. Ed Saleh is the owner of Acer Capital Recovery, a collection agency that specializes in medical and healthcare accounts. Ed has been an active member of the collections industry for nearly 2 decades, having worked his way up to owning his own collection agency. He's played an active role within ACA International and is a very respected member of the ARM industry. Thank you to each of them for participating today. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion moderated by me. We encourage you to submit questions, and we will get to them when the discussion is concluded. To submit a question, please enter it into the question tab on your webinar control panel. For those of you who are watching using your computers to participate, there is no video or presentation. This will be a panel discussion. A recording of the discussion will be made available at a later date. And with that, let's begin today's discussion. Ed, we'll ask you first. Let's start with establishing a baseline. How do you score your accounts?
Our accounts are scored using different attributes from the vendor that we currently use. We're looking at collection accounts. How often were they paid? How many delinquent accounts do they have? Judgments, liens, bankruptcy. So we use a bunch of different attributes to score our accounts for our medical model.
What about you, Mike? Does that sort of fit with what you do at your agency?
Yeah, so we use external sources. So we use a vendor for scoring, but then we've also built our own internal heuristics model for scoring as well. And what we've found is the vendor scoring is really good at correlating with payment outcomes. But when we run it under a regression analysis, and we've used different vendors, by the way, and it's the same outcome each time, is they're not predictive like our internal model is. But we'll talk about more on that later, how there's a strong correlation, but not necessarily in a predictive way.
When you say correlating, you mean just sort of confirming what
so I mean,
expected?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is scores in the broadest possible sense correlate with payment outcomes. So higher scores correlate with more payments, but it doesn't predict payments in the way that most people, I think, are looking for them to predict payments. And I think that's where either internal scoring comes in when you're using your own criterion, or a blended model of vendor and scoring.
And LaDonna, are you using an internal, external, one or the other, or both in terms of your scoring technology?
We're using external, although we have a new analytics person who is kind of playing around with some internal scoring, because we do a lot of utility collections, and a lot of the portfolios are unique by what drives or motivates the consumers to pay. So looking at different attributes that way.
And you're using it. You're using the external scoring as a predictive model for determining. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Ed, let's go back to you. How often are you scoring your accounts? Is it something you're doing on a regular, consistent basis?
Well, it depends on not depends, excuse me. It's the drop. Typically, we're going to drop a business from a healthcare client. We will run it through our system, get rid of all the bankruptcies, the C, so forth and so on. Any Medicare issues, we get rid of that. And then we would go ahead and send it out. We come back with the scores, and we go from there. Now, we will score twice if we keep an account for a year, every 6 months. After that, we won't score again.
Is it just not cost effective at that point? Is that why you don't do it?
It's not cost effective. I mean, somebody's means or financial situation will change every 90 days, just about. But we felt that every 6 months is probably the best thing for our buck. We use that along with other triggers, such as somebody paying off an account, so forth and so on. So when we get a trigger and we look at the score, we can see, hey, this is a 980 score. We have a trigger that they paid somebody else. Let's go after that account and try to get resolution.
And we do the same or similar to that. We'll use the score and a trigger, and some triggers, financial triggers, are better payers than others. And we'll use that as the opportunity to put some additional resources on the account to try to recover it.
Correct. And then it goes into strategy, sending out letters or doing whatever you want to do with that account. But it definitely helps to have a score and to have the triggers.
Yeah. When we first started scoring, and I'll admit that I didn't know what I was doing, and I let a vendor just sell me on it, and a beautiful PowerPoint deck, and I signed on the dotted line, and then we got all these scores in, and we just weren't prepared for it. We didn't have any workflow strategies. We didn't know how we were going to work these, where our model was going to be. So that was an expensive lesson for us to learn. And I would say that's one of the biggest things about scoring is, what's your workflow strategy? Or do you have one already in place, or do you need to develop a new one? Are you going to marry your new scores into your existing, strategies? That's key, I think.
I agree with you 100%.
Let me take a step back, LaDonna, and you mentioned financial triggers. Can you give us a sense of maybe what some of those might be, or some of those are?
Yeah, let's say, for instance, maybe a bank card inquiry. We get notice that you maybe applied for a new MasterCard or a Visa or an Amex, and we get notice of that. Or maybe you've tried to get a new auto lease or auto loan, or maybe you've did a mortgage loan, and there have been inquiries in your credit. And when we get those triggers like that, also comes new contact information and the score. And so you can analyze that based on past performance, as to what you're going to do with that account. If that makes any sense.
Yep, absolutely. Mike, is that when you're using your internal model or the external, is that what you're looking for as well?
Yeah, we do something similar to LaDonna and Ed. So we have our vendor scoring, which is done immediately. And like Ed said, we're going to obviously scrub out anything that we're not going to go after beforehand. But basically, once we get that account, it's going to be scored through our vendor. And then how our internal scoring works. So, and that's once, by the way. So we get our baseline, it's once, and then, we'd recommend triggers after that. And then our internal model, that's nightly. That's an end of day process. And so those scores change literally every day organically based on all the criterion inputs that we have. So class of business, previous payments, right party contacts, tertiary contacts, all the elements that we have in the internal model will affect that score, and it'll change day to day to day to day.
So as an account gets worked during the day, it's updated at night, and then a new strategy is put in place for the next day?
That's correct up until the last point about a new strategy. It may or may not be a new strategy depending on how much that score changes. What we see is the score will change over a longer period of time, of course. So day to day, it won't shift much. But over the course of 30, 60, 90 days, now you're getting into the realm of different strategies because the score has shifted enough.
That makes sense.
Yep. So Ed, let me ask you, you send the account, you send the portfolio out, the scores come back, you scrub out the ones that you're not going to collect. What score or, sort of what baseline are you looking for to determine whether or not you're going to actually put that, which accounts you're going to put into your queue to collect?
We're looking at the top 80% of scores. It's the old adage, 80-20. You get 80% of your revenue from the 20% of your accounts, the top 20%. So we're looking at the top 20. Anything between an 800 score all the way up. Anything less than that, they get less letters, less contacts, so forth and so on. So it's really driven by the upper 80% of the accounts. Now, there may be balance enhancements that we change because our approach is going to change a little bit differently. Tax time, balances are a little bit bigger. We're going to go after the bigger accounts, even though they have a less chance of a payoff because it's that tax time. We're looking for that hit, that quick hit. Usually we're looking at the top 20%, and we're going after 80% of the dollars.
And we mirror pretty much the same thing you said. And, the scores, the actual scores vary from vendor to vendor. Like the scores that we get kind of reflect what you get on your FICO score. They go, up to 850, and we cut off at 620. When we get scores back, we don't put a lot of resources on scores less than 620 because we know what that's yielded us in the past. And then with the seasonality, like you just mentioned with tax time, we'll go back and review some of those accounts, and then we might do some strategic letters, maybe some additional phone calls, et cetera.
And Mike, what about you and American Profit Recovery? How does that work?
So, to answer your question, what determines that? It depends on what vendor you're using. If you're using a vendor, they're going to use terms like lowest risk of repayment and score analysis and all that. But ultimately, you got TransUnion, who has a range from 400 to 900. Experience 350 to 850, LexisNexis 501 to 900. So the ranges are different. They're trying to get at the same aspect, but take into consideration that it may not just be 800 and above if it's Experian that caps out at 850. So that's one thing to note. And then what we've also done is we've tested the same accounts with multiple vendors, and you get completely different results. So a note of caution there. I would always recommend to compare your scores from your vendors against reality, and how well those scores are, in our sense, correlating with your outcomes, because they are drastically different depending on who you're using. And then I would add that, score is important. That's why we're here today talking about it. But score matters less in as far as we're concerned than the distribution of scores. And so what I mean by that is, you go to a mortgage company and they may use a 744 as a cutoff for the best rates, right? Well, why do they use that number? It's because a 744 is 1.5 standard deviations above the mean, where the next mortgage company may use 776, which is 2 standard deviations above the mean. So we're not looking at top 10, top 20, bottom 20. We're looking at distribution of scores within those samples and how many standard deviations above or below the mean they are. So we're getting at the same thing. We're just looking at it through a different lens.
And some of the vendors can even give you a 90-day glance historically into the consumer's, history or spending habits, if you will. So that can also help you make a educated decision on what you want to do with your portfolios.
Yeah, that's a great point, LaDonna. And something else too is null scores, right? So 10 to 20% might not have a score at all. What are you doing with those? Are you treating them like high scoring accounts? Are you checking your results to make a determination what to do with them? And then ultimately, that's where your internal scoring model comes in, is what do you do if you don't get a score back?
Exactly. Those are your credit invisibles. And, there's some possibility they'll pay, and you have to use your internal scoring for those.
Excellent. Well, I want to take a break for a moment. And at this point, I want to stop and talk a little bit about our sponsor, Microbilt. For over 35 years, Microbilt has been helping business assess and manage risk. They were a pioneer in the now exploding alternative credit data space, and as such have refined their products and services to deliver true business value. Over the years, Microbilt has invested heavily in acquiring best-in-class data. They've built sophisticated systems for keeping data fresh and accurate, and powerful predictive models for making decisions around lending, leasing, collections, and risk management. With Microbilt, you can customize the products you need and how much you want to spend, and all the products are provided through a single, simple access portal. Whether you're working in originations or debt collection, screening a potential hire or a tenant, planning for growth, or keeping up with regulatory requirements, Microbilt can be your partner, providing the insight and information you need to protect your business, grow your bottom line, and keep your company running smoothly. For more information or to take advantage of a special offer for everyone who's participating in today's webinar, please contact John Hambrick. John can be reached at 800-884-4747, and that's extension 4447, or his email address is john_Hambrick, that's JOHN_HAMBRICK @microbilt.com. And Microbilt is spelled MICROBILT.com. And I'll give that contact information again at the end of the webinar. So thank you to Microbilt for sponsoring today's event. And now let's get back to our discussion. Mike, I want to follow up on one thing you mentioned, which I think was a really interesting point in testing the different providers against each other and seeing different scores. And then also, how those scores compare to reality. What do you do with those results? Well, actually, let me take a step back first. How do you test against reality? Because it seems like that process of taking in the scores, looking at the scores, actually going out and trying to collect on those accounts, and then comparing the results, that seems like it might be a lot of work. Is it? I mean, is it a big job at your company?
I mean, it's a lot of work and it isn't. And what I mean by that is, we're peeling away 5% of our accounts as a control group, right? So that doesn't mean we're not scoring them. It just means that the scores are masked in a way that we're going to work them like any other account. So depending on how they perform when those scores are masked is going to tell you a lot about how those scores are performing, whether it's predictive or whether it just hangs together and correlates. It's still going to tell you, how well you're doing, how well those scores are doing. Because what you got to take into consideration is if you're actively pursuing 20% of your accounts, and this is an exaggeration, and then leaving 80%, just to kind of twist in the wind, is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? Are you collecting more because you're only pursuing those, and you're not collecting as much because you're not pursuing the rest? And that's what I
gotta stop you there because I think a lot of it comes down to liquidation and batch reports. And when you start looking and getting into the numbers and diving into it, you will see statistically 80% of your revenue is going to come from those 20% of your balance or 20% of your account. So I have to disagree with you there.
And that might be the case in medical. That might very well be. We're not exclusively medical. We handle a bunch of different industries.
So then, do you look at it? I mean, sorry, go ahead, LaDonna. Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, and it also comes down to client expectation. You're going to focus on, 20% of the accounts, for 80% of your money, and that's all well and good. But then those other 80% of the accounts, your client's expecting file penetration and you to do other things as well. And that's okay. But if I have a 30-day file, an early out file, I want to know right up front where my money's coming from so I can get my money out of the way at first and then spend the end of the time that I'm going to have those accounts on the other accounts. You're going to make your money quick.
And you have to.
And then, it comes down to also you can shave a few dollars if, and some people might do it differently, but you take your higher propensity to pay and put them in a house queue and maybe just do letters on them and then, wait 20 days or ever how long you have and then give them to your best collectors to work.
I want to follow up with you, LaDonna, on that, but first I want to go back to something Mike said with regards to different industries. Is there in terms of the type of debt you're trying to collect, is there a difference in the scores and how that correlates?
The biggest difference is class of business between class of businesses, not within class of businesses. And so, we're going to pick up 70% of our collections in 50% of our placements. Quite a bit different, but it's going to be the biggest difference between industries, not within.
Got it.
And let me add to that,
go ahead.
I was going to add to what y'all were talking about. There's seasonality to it as well, like with a utility portfolio. Consumers, have no tendency to want to pay a gas bill in the middle of July, but when the first cold snap comes, there are things that motivate them to pay. So your bottom scorers will come up and pay. So, just like you said, between the classes of business, there are differences.
How do you account for that? Are you looking at the weather forecast to see if there's going to be a cold snap, or is that just one of those sort of situations where you really don't know it until you start getting the calls?
Actually, I do look at the weather because, we've been doing utilities for a long time and, we like it when there's harsh winters and cold snaps because we know that that's going to be, larger dollar amounts and bigger placements and such. And then, again, when October, November comes, the people that had no interest in paying you earlier in the year, now they want to pay.
Do you notice any of that, Ed, with healthcare? I know you talked a little bit about tax refunds, but do you notice any seasonality or any sort of outlying factors
Absolutely.
over and above the score?
Absolutely. Pediatric. Time of year, kids are going to school. What happens? They need their immunization records, they need their shots, and they can't go to school unless they have them. And what happens? They call us because the rest of the year the year before that, they had no they didn't want to pay for the account, but all of a sudden they have to have the stuff done and our phones are ringing. It happens. I think it happens in a lot of classes of business, different classes, especially like utilities. Yeah. I used to live in Arizona. It's a big snowbird state. They move. They go back and forth from the house up north to the house back in Arizona. And that time of the year, when it starts to get a little bit warmer in Arizona, they leave. And when it starts to get cooler, they're back and they got to pay their utility bills. So it's all by different classes.
Excellent. I want to remind everybody who's participating, if you have any questions, please enter them into the question tab and we'll get to them a little later in our discussion. There are a few questions there already, but if you have any others, by all means, please feel free to shoot them off now. So Mike, let me ask you sort of what the thrust of the top or the conversation is today. How does scoring influence your company's collection strategy? Can you give us some insight into what changes you might make based on what you get or what you're seeing with either your internal or your external scores?
Yeah, I think it's, the point that was made a few minutes ago about the class of business and time of year. Specifically what we see during income tax time is you can take the scores and throw them out the window. They perform terribly during income tax time. And part of it is you're spending more efforts on high value accounts and not paying as much attention to the rest of them. Another aspect of that is the responsible consumers are picking up the phones when you call them, and you're setting up payment plans, and maybe someone who's not as responsible has that forced savings that is the income tax return, and they got to clean up their credit. So there is a seasonality to it. I just kind of wanted to chime in there. But as far as scoring is concerned, it's a factor, and it's a big factor. And it drives, the way we look at it is our scores drive our contacts. And the bottom line is you're trying to get at liquidation rates, and you're trying to spend smart money up front to drive those contacts to get those payments. And it affects everything we do. Internal and external scoring affects every part of our business and our workflows.
Does that mean that and I guess I'll use, sort of the art versus science debate. Does that mean it's basically sort of all science now and less, going with that gut feeling?
I wouldn't say it's less art. I think when the collectors are on the phones having their conversations, there's still an element of art involved. But I think on the back end, statistics and algorithms have been in business for a long time, and I think collection agencies are just starting to take advantage of some of the models out there. I think when you're talking about controlling for outcomes and the predictability of scores, I think it's getting there, but I think there's still more science to come. I mean, it's fine if your numbers show one thing, but is it statistically significant under a regression model? Well, that's a question you can only answer in science. It can't be answered with a gut check or anything else. Is it statistically significant or it isn't? There's some standards that are involved there where you don't have standards when you're kind of just flying by the seat of your pants.
Got it. And have you noticed, Mike mentioned sort of the account scoring is becoming more and more popular and more commonplace within the industry. Have you seen an improvement in account scores? Are they getting better and more accurate?
I think they're getting more accurate. I would like to start seeing more of the social media side place into, emphasizing into the scores. But I definitely think they're getting more accurate. I mean, scoring's been out for how long? Almost 15 years now? They've been scoring, so obviously things are going to get better as time matures.
And now that there's more players in the game, the vendors I found are more flexible with the products and customizing products to suit your business need. When you talk about class of business, there's a difference between medical and telecom and utility and credit cards. So, the vendors are now more willing to customize something for the shops to give them the best type of scores and such.
Ed, you mentioned social media. Can you talk a little bit about what you'd like to see and how you'd like to see that integrated?
We integrate a lot of skip tracing using social media. And obviously we don't talk to anybody through that mean, but we do a lot of digging around and searching for that information. So we'll go on Facebook, and if we can find somebody's phone number, if we have somebody's number, we'll plug it into Facebook, and it'll pop up their portfolio or their profile. From the profile, you can usually see if they've been out to eat, where they possibly work, so forth and so on. So if we have a better idea of what that person's doing or what their life is like, we can really hone in and say, listen, this person's working. They have, 3 kids, and looking at other attributes, maybe we need to give them a soft type of approach. Maybe send them a letter explaining, we would like to help you out or reach out to you that way. Or if we see somebody that just bought a car, our approach is going to be a little bit more different.
And you'd like to see them figure out a way to kind of integrate that?
I would love for them to integrate that, absolutely, because they're giving us information. Information is power, right? So the more information that we have from somebody, and any good collector can look at an account and say, I think this person has a likelihood of paying better than any analytic score. Any good collector will do that. So if I'm looking at an account, I see that they have, a couple, the credit bureaus are right, but I know the person lives in a good area code or a good zip code. They have a house. They have gainful employment. I know that that account's going to be a little bit more better for me to collect, or for one of my collectors to collect.
Mike, is that something you'd like to see integrated into your external scoring service? Are there other areas or other things you'd like to see added, or have the model refined further?
Yeah, I mean, LaDonna makes a good point about the vendors being flexible. And it used to scoring. So getting back to scoring and is it improving? It was heavily based on demographics. Demographics. And now, because of the credit bureaus are players in this, what an invaluable resource for us trying to get these scores. And the bottom line is the best predictor of future behavior, past behavior. And so, the 90-day look back, that needs to be 365 days. 2 years, 3 years. The farther back we look at someone's behavior, the better off we're going to be when it comes to actually using and having predictive models, which is what we're after. We're after predictive models. And when I find a vendor that can stand up to a regression analysis and it's a predictive model, it's going to be terrific. We're not there yet, but we're getting there.
And social media is important for, generational collections, with the millennials, and because that's where they are. They're on social media, and a lot, might be your credit invisibles there.
Well, we've talked a lot about this at different times, but LaDonna, maybe I'll ask you, just to sort of go over again the other factors that are included when sort of ranking or prioritizing your accounts for collections. We've talked about seasonality, we've talked about taxes, we've talked about different types of debt, but maybe you could just kind of sum that all up in one time to give our listeners a better idea of how you prioritize your accounts.
Well, one of the first things that we look at is, how long we're going to keep the account. And that makes a difference in when we score it and how many times we score it, what type of portfolio it is. And then we also look at, when it comes to our work strategies based on scoring, we have to go back, and it gets a little complex by looking at the scopes of work with our contracts with our clients, because, some clients are very specific, first letter within 48 hours of receipt, first outbound call within 7 days, and that might not fit into our strategies with our scores. And we've had to actually go back to clients and renegotiate and show numbers where, this is why our recoveries are improving, because this is what we're doing. And, we'd like a little bit of an adjustment here or amendment in our contract to fit it more in line with our work strategies. And we've had some successes with that, and some successes, some not so successful. So it also depends on your client contracts as well. Balances, come into play, age of the debt, of course.
And especially, LaDonna, especially if it's a new client that you've never worked before.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to get them to understand that.
Yep.
And they're just like, no, you just stick to the script, first outbound call within 7 days, first letter, within 24 hours, et cetera. So we have to stick to the script, so to speak. But that doesn't really stop us from scoring, because, with a lot of the vendors, you get a you can get tiered pricing. You know, with the number more accounts you score, of course, the cheaper your pricing.
Ed, you mentioned the 80-20 or the 20-80 rule, which I think is a really interesting idea. How much? I mean, is that a hard and fast rule at your agency? I mean, what other are there other influences that have that can impact an account other than an account score that can impact the decision to put it in the queue?
The age of account. First off, the 80-20 is not a hard fact. That's what we go after for the first 90 days of the account. After that, we start divvying up the accounts based on score or based on other attributes, mail return, skip trace, so forth. So I don't want to sit there and say that that's the only way we work the accounts. It's not. What was the other part of your question, Mike?
Just what other what other influences, what other things influence a decision to put an account in the queue? So, for you to sort of go after an account.
Again, triggers on their credit bureau. If we're getting any triggers at all, the likelihood of them being sued, how many judgments do they have, how many liens are placed onto their public records. So we're looking at other attributes also. So it's not just scoring that we rely on.
Got it. Mike, how often are you refining or tweaking the account scoring process to sort of make sure it reflects with your past performance?
So we're looking at it every quarter. So it's not that we're adding criterion every quarter, but we do look at it every quarter to make sure it's performing within a reasonable, within reasonable standards, a reasonable room for error.
Got it. Ed, what about your firm? How often are you tweaking or changing the model?
Every quarter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Ed, again, you said you followed 80-20 for 90 days. Does that mean that after that, you sort of go after the lowest rated accounts? Is that the process there?
It doesn't really depend, but we're looking at liquidation, right? So how much will be collected off a segment of accounts that were placed at a certain time period? About 90 days is where you get from 0 to 90 days is where you get your lift. After that, it starts to travel downwards, right, in your stair step. So typically, we're looking at the 0 to 90 out of the gate. If you come out strong, it's going to carry you through however long you have those accounts. I'm breaking up.
And what about you, LaDonna? Can you talk a little bit about how, what kind of attention the lower scored accounts get at your firm?
Well, and again, it goes back to seasonality and client expectation. Sometimes we have to send that letter or we have to make so many phone calls, but we might not put out any extra resources, like a lot of times during tax season, regardless of the score, we'll send some extra letters out, but maybe if historical performance shows that this particular score doesn't pay whether you send a letter or not, we might not do that. So it all depends on the portfolio and what your historical performances show. And I had to keep going back to the vendors, but a lot of times I'll put it back on my vendor and go, hey, evaluate this because, I don't think that we're seeing, getting the return on investment that we should be getting, and let them offer some suggestions or maybe some freebies for us. Because, they're the experts and they're the ones that, we're getting the data from. So I always like to get them to look at what, we're getting back and, make suggestions.
And how responsive or receptive are they normally?
If you get a good vendor, they're very responsive and very receptive. And I like to make sure, going into the relationship that we understand what the expectations are, because I learned from that first time, after I had that nice PowerPoint deck and I signed the contract, the sales guy moved on somewhere else. and there was nobody else really that wanted to reach out and put us where we needed to be and help us. But so having learned that, I put more expectations on the vendors, just like our clients put on us. And they're all willing because it's so competitive.
Yeah, I've never had a vendor
Mike,
say, let me not take a look at it. Or I don't want to look at that.
Yep.
Mike, I want to go back to something you said earlier in terms of getting different scores from different vendors. Do you take that information back to the vendor? I mean, is there a conversation about how they can refine their model or anything like that? How does a conversation flow?
The conversation is, we're using your services because you perform better than anyone else, or we are not using your services because you don't.
Very straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, so the bottom line with regards to, making tweaks and so on and so forth is, I think we all agree that your high scoring, however you define that, we're going to say at least one standard deviation above a mean, top 20%, your A and B buckets, however you define that, you're going to want to put immediate efforts towards to collect them quickly. And your low scoring accounts, you're going to want to use your least costly and most passive approaches, whatever that is for you. For us, the most costly thing we do is have a collector pick up a phone and make a call or search on social media. That's really expensive. Letters are less expensive, and, manually assisted, formerly auto dialing, is the least expensive. So just be smart and spend your money smartly.
And mitigate your risk.
Yep.
What do you mean by that, LaDonna?
Well, like he pointed out, it's very costly when the rep picks up the phone and makes that call. So if the less accounts you have to handle, the less consumers you're going to actually touch. So you're mitigating your risk for, a bona fide error, no mini Miranda, or,
a technical violation.
Yeah, technical violation, what have you. So maybe your scoring model, and you might not touch that segment of accounts if that fits in with your business practice.
Mike, how do you test and compare to see if the reason somebody paid or didn't pay was because of sort of the work that was done in trying to collect that account? Like you were talking about, sort of a more passive approach to the lower scoring accounts. How do you know that that's the reason they paid or didn't pay? Did you test that?
Are you talking about multivariate analysis of covariates? Do you want to get that granular?
As much as it would excite me, I can't imagine that everybody shares my enthusiasm for it. Right.
Yeah. MANOVA. Yeah. I mean, they're just statistic models. They're not trade secrets. You can find them in any advanced math book on statistics, or you can Google statistics and normal distribution curves, regression analysis. It's just the lens that we choose to look at scores under to determine if they're statistically significant. Like you said, it's all science.
Got it. Ed, let me ask you this: do you share account scores that you get with your clients?
If they ask. I will not, if they ask, or, they can actually log in and look and see what the score is if they want to. But typically, I'm not going to send out a full-fledged report with all the scores on them. Because honestly, my clients don't have time to look at the accounts unless we're doing an audit or unless we're looking at it or performance is bad. They have other things to worry about. As long as we're doing a great job for them, we're not getting complaints, which we haven't had one. We're doing, liquidating, and the remits are sent out. They're happy.
What about, if you ever have a discussion or a debate, or if it even escalates to an argument, like if an agency or if a client's asking you why you're not doing something a certain way or why you're not calling certain accounts, do you use the score as a reason for why you've deployed a certain strategy?
I don't do anything without client knowing what we're doing. I don't tell them what strategy we're doing, or I don't not tell them what strategy we're using. They know what we're doing, but they don't really have time to look at their accounts on an account specific an account specific account at a time. So they're looking at the big picture. I'm bringing it all the way down to individual accounts that we're looking at.
Okay. We talked a little bit about risk mitigation, and it's impossible to have a collections-related conversation these days without talking about compliance. So let me fulfill that responsibility and bring up compliance. But are there, do compliance items like different forms of consent or things like that, is that considered when deciding whether or not to collect on an account? LaDonna, we'll start with you.
Now, what do you mean by different forms of consent?
Well, I guess whether or not you've got, whether or not you've gotten consent versus whether or not that's come from your client, or whether you've got it in writing, or whether it's on a recorded phone call. Sort of different, different kinds of consent can come in different forms, I guess, is what I meant. Or just generically, do you look at whether or not what you have sort of from a compliance perspective, or your risk possibly for some kind of lawsuit or potential violation, does that get factored into whether or not you're going to collect on an account?
Yes, and we throw some demographics into that as well, based on past performance, where lawsuits are coming from, or, the predatory attorneys are, and where they're trying to hit. And there are, geographic locations where you get more threats of lawsuits and actual lawsuits from. So we just kind of tread lightly in those areas with, what we do. But again, sometimes, everybody's in the pool when it comes to getting a score. Then we'll break it down by the demographics as to what we're going to do with that portfolio to kind of mitigate risk. Like if I know zip code 30907, we've had, complaints, CFB complaints, BBB complaints, lawsuits, out of that area. We're going to tread lightly there with what we do, regardless of the score. If that makes any sense.
Got it. Yep. Ed, Mike, do you have anything to add on top of that?
It's just being constantly aware of what attorneys are filing suits, and Web Recon, you got a great product. I don't want to throw a plug out there, but I'll do it for Jack. Got to have that litigious information. You got to have it in front of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add a word. I would add a word of caution. Just kind of big picture is desperate treatment. If you have consumers where you're never attempting to letter or call, just kind of keep that in mind. We letter everything. That doesn't mean that there's not mail returns, but if there's accounts that you're never attempting to collect, and then it's adversely affecting their the rates they're paying on loans, something to be cognizant of at very least.
Well, there are a number of questions that have come in, and we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to try and get through these. Again, if you have any questions, we're getting close to this being your last chance to submit it, so please enter them into your control panel. We'll start with here. If you could only have one trigger to use, which one would it be?
I like bank card inquiry. I like bank card inquiry.
Me too.
I think you found a winner.
What is it about bank card inquiry that makes it your first choice?
Well, for my first choice, it kind of, to me, sends out, the consumer mindset, hey, I'm trying to get a credit card, and maybe they're on the right track and they're trying to do the right thing, and maybe they just forgot about this debt and they just need a gentle nudge, and oh yeah, or maybe they've got that bank card and it was approved, and now I know that you have a MasterCard with a $3,000 credit limit, so I'm going to call you.
But it also gives you new contact information too.
Yeah, that's the bonus there, and it's usually pretty accurate.
Yep, because they're getting it right from the application.
And when you call, they pick up the phone for some reason.
Yeah. Amazing.
And they're quick, and it's very quick. you know, because you get the point of sale credit applications, you know, like you go to, say, you know, Macy's or somewhere, and they go, you want to put on your charge, and you say, well, I don't have one. They say, well, you can apply right there at the kiosk, and you get a little slip of paper saying that you have, you know, $500 credit limit to spend as you choose. That information goes to the credit bureaus, and then, you know, if you have a trigger subscription, you're getting it in your next trigger file.
Yep.
And that is fresh information. I get a little excited.
No, that's fine. It's great. I like enthusiasm's a good thing.
We're all passionate.
Can you please discuss whether you would recommend using one scoring vendor or multiple scoring vendors?
I would do a demo with all. I would do a product testing with all three, and, you know, try to get some freebies. I didn't mean to say all three, but, you know, with the ones that you're looking at, and see which one's going to work best for you. Because most of them will give you a free trial period, you know.
Is it a situation where everybody's, you know, sort of your mileage may vary? Every agency will get a different result based on where they are, what they're collecting, who they're collecting on behalf of, and that's why they should be testing as many different vendors as possible?
Yeah, and then, you know, get referrals from, you know, your friends in the industry, you know, as to what works. You know, we like to go with the vendors that give us the accurate information. You know, if we're evaluating the information we're getting back and not getting the results, then I'm going to look at, you know, well, how fresh is this data that this vendor is giving me? You know, is it being resold to them from somebody else? Well, why don't I just go to the person that's selling it?
I agree. I'd use one vendor, but try a bunch out.
Are you scoring for collectability or for contactability?
Is it what my vendor tells me or what we find in reality? So we're using Score to drive contacts, and we find that contacts predict those outcomes that you're looking for, payments, payment plans, etc. So you can use Score in the same way. Just because we're not finding it's predictive doesn't mean you can't use scores the same way as if they were. Our point is, if it is a predictive model, that's the vendor I want to use. None of them seem to be there yet, but they're on their way. So scores are great. We use it to drive contacts.
What about you, Ed?
We use it for both. You know, we're using it to make some money and put money back in our clients' pockets, and obviously that comes from contacts. So I have to say both.
And it's chicken or egg theory here. You know, you can't get the money unless you make the contact.
Okay.
Yeah, think about it this way. Why do high scoring accounts not pay? It's because you never get them on the phone. And the other side of the same coin is, you know, what's the number one reason people donate to charities? It's because they were asked.
Yeah.
So that's the different side of the same coin.
That's a good point. How do you develop an internal score when you have no history of a debtor unless you are using the credit history from the client on a particular customer?
So that goes back to the criterion conversation that we had. So criterion, what inputs are you using? So you can use, there's a ton, right? So client historical payment rates, client historical recovery rates, class of business payment rates, class of business recovery rates, contacts, right party contacts, previous payments. Nothing beats a score but a payment, right? Someone who pays something is going to pay something more. But class of business, tertiary contacts, it was surprising to us, and we put it in just to see what would happen. But when you have we'll say you talk with someone who's not a right party contact and you leave a message, you're more likely to get that bill paid. Who knew? But there's a bunch of different things, inputs that you can use. Those are just a few.
Yeah. I think I know the answer. I think this question's been answered, but I'm going to ask it anyways just to make sure. Does anyone use the credit reporting info in the form of daily triggers to overlay the predictive model scores. I think you've all talked about doing that, right? Using positive triggers, like the consumer made a recent payment on one of his trade lines or her trade lines.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct, but I mean, if they're going to have a lower behavior score, chances of them getting the card are going to be very, very minor.
Do you use age as a factor for collection? For example, do you call older generations, or do you call them more, or do they pay better?
Our approach is different, but you know, like with the Gen Xers were the baby boomers were the largest generation in the workplace. Now Gen Xers are, but Gen Xers are now we're finding are taking care of their parents and their grown children. So it all depends. We find that the millennials are the hardest to get a hold of. So we do break down the data a little bit like that, but then so many other factors come into play to where, you know, if you pick, you know, 23C, you don't get an egg roll with that one. So, you know, it comes down to how your portfolio is performing or how you want it to perform.
Got it. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and I don't want to take up more time of our speakers than I promised I would. So I want to thank LaDonna, Mike, and Ed for their insights and time today. I thought it was a great conversation. I thought they shared a lot of interesting and important details, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, or are as enthusiastic about it as I am. Again, and also this webinar would not have been possible without their participation nor the sponsorship of Microbilt. So I want to thank them for sponsoring today's webinar. Please go to www.microbilt.com to learn more about the company, and be sure again to contact John Hambrick to take advantage of a special offer available to webinar participants. John can be reached at 1-800-884-4747, and that's he's at extension 4447. Or you can email him at john_Hambrick@microbilt.com. Thank you to everybody who participated today, who submitted questions or who listened in. Please stay tuned to accountsrecovery.net for news and more webinars in the very near future, as well as a recording of this event. And please be sure to enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Ed, Don, it was a pleasure.
You too.
Thank you. Yes, likewise.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, LaDonna, Mike, and Ed.